Hello and welcome to Chillers and Thrillers. I am your host, Em, and in this podcast, I read true stories about people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, skepticism, or gore, only 100% true spooky tales. This episode was originally going to be about tales of people who encountered the Man in the Hat, a paranormal entity that seems like it visits people during bouts of sleep paralysis. The Man in the Hat is usually categorized into the paranormal phenomenon known as shadow people. Theories on what or whom the shadow people are differ, from interdimensional beings that are observing our world to demonic figures. However, in researching my stories for this episode, I found that there seems to be a common thread that links shadow beings together: negativity, dread, or fear. Whether the shadow figures bring these emotions with them or they are attached to them is unknown. But in this episode, I'll be reading true stories of people who encountered either the Man in the Hat or these strange entities that seem to feed off the negativity in their lives. I would like to sincerely thank listener Jane Marie, who shared her story with me. Jane Marie, I really appreciate you trusting me with your story, and her story will be first in this episode. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and listen in. My experience, submitted by listener Jane Marie. I have had many paranormal experiences from the time I was young. I thought I'd share a couple of instances that happened in my adult life. After getting married, my now ex-husband and I moved into a beautiful cottage in the mountains of California. He soon started lying and picking fights, creating tensions between us. Since I was raised Christian, I was desperate to stabilize our marriage, so we began studying the Bible together to strengthen our relationship, especially with the baby on the way. One night, my husband started arguing with me. I was really trying to avoid arguing with him. I was still in the bliss of the future and thoughts of everything that was happening to our small family. Then he started raising his voice, and I raised mine to match. By the time my voice came up, though, there was this presence. It's hard to describe, but it was a very heavy presence. We heard knocking on the cottage walls, and then we heard something so heavy, as if it were crawling on the roof. The only way I could describe it was like something heavy crawling over the cottage roof. We could hear it above us. My legs felt so heavy all of a sudden that I could barely move. When we heard the crawling sounds, I jumped on the couch and looked at my husband, and he was just staring back at me, telling me to be quiet. We were both quiet for a while, and then as soon as we accepted it was just a weird occurrence and started to get comfortable again, the fight started up, and we started to raise our voices once more. Then the knocking started. But this time, the knocking was coming from underneath the house. After that incident, I reached out to our landlord who lived nearby to discuss what it could have possibly been. We lived on our landlord's property, which is a beautiful luxury estate with a pool house, tennis courts, and horse farms. The landlords lived up in a beautiful mansion that they had built above our cottage, and our cottage was originally part of the land. It had been a caretaker's home, and before us, an ex-cop had lived there. Anyway, when I went to the owner, he said that there was a ghost or some kind of entity in that house, and when he and his wife had been living there while the big house was getting built, whenever his wife would start to drink and raise her voice, the knocking and crawling sounds would start. I laughed it off because I thought he was joking, and when I reached out to him, I just wanted to ask if maybe we should check for raccoons or something underneath the house. That's when he smiled and said, "Oh, I'm not joking. If you guys have your first argument or disagree on anything and raise your voices, that's when it will happen." He started to tell us about how his wife would drink her wine at night, and then if she would ever yell out for something, it would start up. Moving forward, some people wanted to stop by because they wanted to visit the ranch and see the horses. So we entertained some people out at the barn. One lady in particular came with me to the cottage because I wanted to give her a tour. It was such a beautiful house and it had a great view. But as soon as she walked through, she seemed like she was in an immediate hurry to get out. I couldn't understand why, and I later asked her, "Did I say something to offend you?" And she said, "I don't mean to frighten you, but when I went to your cottage, I felt a presence that didn't want me there. I don't know how to describe it, but it was a very negative and a very dark kind of thing. Please don't think I'm weird. I was afraid to tell you, but I just felt so uneasy, like I was being watched." I told this to my husband, and because of the knocking and the crawling sounds, we didn't really argue much after that. Eventually, I had the baby, and we decided that we had outgrown the cottage and moved. About 7 years later, we moved into an older yellow home that was built in the 1950s. We moved in, and it wasn't until my husband and I started having more problems again that the noises would start. He would start to raise his voice at me or do something weird or off-putting, and we would hear noises like knocking, and it would scare him. He would actually stop, and I thought, well, if it scares him, maybe that's good. I didn't know if it was the same thing we had at the cottage or if it was something new. I still don't know what to think. Fast forward a bit more, I kicked my husband out of the house and we're now getting divorced. By then, we had already had another baby, and I'm living there by myself with my 2 children. As time goes by, I started dating someone, and I warned the man that I was dating to just not lie to me. Because of my ex-husband's constant lying, I was really adamant about being in a healthy, trust-based relationship. At this point, my youngest son had just turned 4, and he would run up to me at night because he didn't want to sleep in his room. He would love to sleep with me, but this particular night, he was just refusing to go back to his bedroom. He was standing at the bedroom door asking to sleep with me. I went to the door to walk him back to bed, and right then, when I got up to my son, he just goes, "Oh, there he is. I'll be good," then marched into his room. He seemed scared, and when he said, "Okay, I'll be good," it was as if whatever he saw reminded him of a father figure or someone in authority, kind of like they were wagging his finger at him saying, "Son, listen to your mother." He walked back to his bedroom like a little soldier. Later on, when I spoke to my son about it, he described what he saw as a man with a hat, like a shadow. And we all felt very scared. A little while after that happened, my boyfriend and I were getting into an argument. At this point, I was just tired. I wanted to go to sleep, and I went silent. But as we quieted down, we started hearing footsteps in the bedroom. Footsteps like someone dragging their feet. My boyfriend, who I hadn't told any of the paranormal stuff to, turned on the lights so fast. He was incredibly spooked. He had never had any other paranormal experience in his life, and this was his first encounter. But that made me think. I thought the original things and occurrences had been tied to my ex-husband. So why is it still happening? I had a friend who I had shared this story with come to my house, and they said that they felt whatever was in the house was protective of me. I did go see a psychic at one point as well, who claimed that I had a very tall guide protecting me because of my divorce and some other occurrences that were tied to my ex-husband. I don't know what it was. It was really strange. I don't know the real answers to any of that, but that was my experience in the cottage and the yellow house. It's an unforgettable experience, and I'd love to know what it was and why it happened. But that's my story. The Shadow Man, submitted by user Michael Barnes. We lived in our house for about 3 years now, but back about 6 months into the place, my wife came upstairs, completely terrified, in the middle of the night. There's a man in River's room. I knew right away that she didn't mean a physical man. I went up into his room. He was asleep, but the atmosphere was heavy, like electrically heavy. I got my wife to explain what happened. It was probably around 2 a.m. All the lights were off. Our bedroom is across the hall from his. She was asleep and heard him making sounds in his bed, so she looked up. In his room, she saw the figure of a man walk across and stand over our son River's bed. The funny thing is that the way she described it, it was exactly like how people describe shadow people, to a T. The staggering movements like you're looking at a video game image dropping frames and so forth. But she actually had never even heard of that. She's never been interested in these kinds of subjects. So I thought, okay, that's really messed up. But being a skeptic, I'm also thinking that it's probably a half-awake hallucination or something. But I couldn't deny that something about his room was off. So to make her feel better about it, I broke out the sage and smudged the room. My wife and I are Cherokee. Things got a little weirder. River started talking, he was about 3 years old at the time, about a black man in his room that would come out of his closet. It sounds almost stupid writing about it because it's just cliched ghost story junk. But there it is. And he was too little to have really any kind of cultural knowledge about that kind of archetype. I got him to draw what he was saying, and he pretty much just drew a black stick figure with a cape. So my wife kind of got wigged out about all of this, and she got in touch with a spiritual advisor, which I immediately voiced my objection to, because that kind of stuff is where you start getting into some serious BS. But it was this lady that someone she was close to was friends with. She was very sensitive apparently, and specifically she was a remote viewer. So I told my wife, okay, we're going to give her this amount of money today, then we're supposed to pay her that amount of money next week and a follow-up amount of money each month to keep the ghost out of our house. Well, my wife insisted, and we got this lady on the phone, and I listened in. It kind of freaked me out, because she described exactly the layout of our house, even though she didn't have our address, was never anywhere near our house, and in fact, lived in North Carolina. And specifically, she said, you've got some kind of thing going on in what seems to be a child's room in the back right corner of the house on the top floor. We didn't tell her anything about the apparition or whatever. She was right on the money. My blood turned cold. She explained that there was something. She specifically said an entity passing through there, and that it was sort of caught for a reason she couldn't work out. She didn't know what exactly it was, but there was an energy there that was sort of not moving. She said she'd done so much clearing stuff, all remote viewing, and it would fix whatever was going on there. And she didn't charge us at all. But I'll tell you what, the entire atmosphere of our house changed after that. Whatever she did, which may have been nothing more than hanging up the phone and saying, well, that fooled them, something about the air in our house changed. When we moved in, we kind of felt like the house was almost too dark and stuffy, which we figured was just from moving in from another house that was smaller and on a hill. But it literally felt like some weight had been lifted from the house. It could all be nothing. Maybe my wife just saw a shadow move across the starlight. Maybe it's all just a psychological thing we've led ourselves to believe. Or maybe it really was something. The Black Hat Man, submitted by user trxFoxHole. The house I grew up in was built by my family, and family members always resided in it. The house was one of the first built in my sleepy little hometown. I was about 3 years old when my family moved in. My first bedroom was one in the front of the house. I don't remember much in that room, but it wasn't long until I was moved into my brother's room across the hall in bunk beds. That is the bedroom I remember growing up in. Along came my sister, and she soon occupied my original bedroom. Being 4 years apart in age, I didn't keep tabs on my sister's doing. Not until she started sleeping in my parents' room. It wasn't until I was older that I would hear the stories about why my sister and I didn't like staying in that room. Apparently, like clockwork, shortly after 2 a.m., every night, my sister and I would wake up crying and distraught when we slept in that bedroom. I don't remember anything specific from that room, just always being scared. My sister's stories are a little more specific. A man, dressed in all black, with a black hat, would tell my sister how bad she was. This became a nightly ritual. My parents had enough and just had my sister sleep on their bedroom floor. This lasted for months. It just so happened that my father was telling one of his aunts about my sister and her experience in the front bedroom. Without a word, the aunt went upstairs and returned with a small vial of water. She gave my father instructions to sprinkle the water around the room and have the room blessed. My father followed the instruction, and they were finally able to coax my sister into sleeping in her own bed again. After a lot of encouragement, she did, and eventually slept in her bedroom again. The vial of water was holy water that my aunt had gotten while visiting the Vatican. I don't remember the exact scripture that was read, but from what I understand, it was rather pertinent to the events that went on in the room. Fast forward 15 to 20 years later, I'm dating a single mother who's now my wife, and she has a 3-year-old son. We all crashed on the family homestead before heading off to the beach early the next morning. We tuck our son into bed in the now spare bedroom and go back upstairs to watch some TV before retiring for the night ourselves. About an hour after tucking her son in, he comes back downstairs and said he couldn't sleep. When asked why, he said, "Because of the man in black." I had never told my girlfriend the story of that bedroom, and she had no clue of what had happened. Creepy Abraham Lincoln, submitted by user Rocketfool. When I was a little girl, about 6 years old, I lived with my mom, who had a graveyard shift as a telephone operator, and my dad, who was a state worker. Being that my mom worked the graveyard shift, I knew that she left around 9 or 10 p.m. and then returned home around 6 or so in the morning. My father worked the normal 9 to 5, so there was always someone around to take care of me. One night, around 11:30 at night, my mom had already left for work. I was sleeping in my own room, and even though it was dark, my father was in his room across the hall watching Johnny Carson. I dozed off, and then I woke up probably around midnight. The whole house was dark, the TV was off, and my nightlight, which I could never sleep without, had been removed from the wall socket for some reason. My dad knew I couldn't sleep without the nightlight, and so did my mom, so there was no reason it should be out. Terrified at the thought of monsters or aliens under my bed, I jumped out of the bed and ran across the hall to my dad's room. He said I could sleep with him as long as I promised not to kick. I was a rambunctious sleeper as a child, and feeling content sleeping next to my 200-pound Vietnam veteran dad, I quickly fell back asleep. A few hours later, I woke up to the sound of my dad snoring. He had his back turned to me and was facing the closet. I lifted my head and noticed the electrical clock on the nightstand said it was 1:43 a.m. in very clear red numbers. As I lay back down, I knew it was too early for my mom to be home, so I just lay there, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Then, some movement caught my eye in my dad's closet. It wasn't a huge closet, and we had no indoor pets who could have possibly snuck in. I noticed that the left door was starting to slide slowly to the right, as if someone were opening it from the inside. My father always closed both doors at night, so my first thought was that someone had broken into the house when we didn't notice, hid in the closet, and now was out to murder us. As the door opened, a man stepped out, without really stepping. It was a fluid movement because he just slid out. Even though there was some light coming from the window on the other side of the room, his entire silhouette, his body was a silhouette akin to that of Abraham Lincoln. He looked tall, thin, and was wearing what I could only describe as a stovepipe hat. His shoulders were pointed, and it looked as if he were wearing a dark overcoat with no real form other than the fact that it swished when he moved. I panicked and shut my eyes, thinking this was only the dark playing tricks on me. Not more than a second later, I opened my eyes, and he was no longer swooping out of the closet, but was standing right next to my side of the bed. He stood over me, blocking my view of the window and any light that came through it. Then he lifted his hand, which was big and thin, and started to move it closer to my face, with his fingers spread. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't even move. All I saw was the light of the room ebbing as the hand got bigger and closer, just the same as an eclipse blocking the sun. Just before he was about to smother me, I flipped over and wrapped my arms around my dad's neck. I held on as tightly as I could, believing that if this guy was going to kidnap me, he had to pry me from my dad. Just then, my dad woke up because I was holding his neck so tight. He turned over and asked me what was the matter and flipped the light on his side of the bed. My dad sat up, held me, and asked me what was wrong. When I opened my eyes, there was no one in the room except me and my dad. I started crying and I told him I saw someone come out of the closet who looked like Abraham Lincoln. My dad grabbed his gun from the closet and ran to the hallway. He turned on every light in the house, checked every window, every door, and every closet. He went outside with a flashlight and canvassed the whole yard and even the roof, just to be sure no one was hiding up there. When he came back in, he told me there was no one there. There was no one anywhere. He said I probably just had a bad dream and that he would leave on the hall light. Just before he lay down, I looked at the clock and it was a little after 2 a.m., still too early for my mom to be home. Years later, when I was in my teens and my parents had divorced and were living in separate houses, my mom and I were talking over dinner in her kitchen. She mentioned how she used to see creepy things in her grandmother's house back in rural Texas. I then told her, for the first time, about creepy Abraham Lincoln coming out of the closet and trying to suffocate me. When I finished, she looked at me real funny, as if I had confessed to a murder. She asked, What did he look like again? And I said, like a creepy Abraham Lincoln with a stovepipe hat and a dark cape or overcoat or something. She looked at me again and wanted to know where I had heard this story, and I told her angrily that I hadn't heard it, I had lived it. Then she told me about the time when she was 6 years old, staying at her grandmother's house, and a man came out of the closet and tried to smother her with his large, thin hand. She said he was about 6 feet tall and that you can never see his face. He always blocked out all of the light in the room as he came closer. Just when he was about to grab her, she turned away and looked back, seeing nothing, but knowing that she was the only one in the house who was fully awake. She told me that not only had she seen this creepy figure coming out of the closet, but so had my aunts, my grandmother, on her side of the family. None of her brothers had ever heard of anything like that. Only the women in the family had seen it. The Shadow Creature, submitted by user emberdione. I was mid-divorce from my ex and unfortunately still living with him. It's California and I couldn't afford to live on my own in that area. We had a 3-bedroom place, so we had separate bedrooms and bathrooms, and it wasn't that bad. I slept in the master bedroom, he had the second bedroom, and our son slept in the last bedroom. All of these were on the upstairs floor. The whole downstairs was the living room and kitchen. When we first moved in, the place was awesome, and I strongly viewed it as a new start for our family, since we had had some very bad years and things had been really toxic. 3 years later, I had finally given up, filed for divorce, and things would fluctuate from being much better to being much worse, depending on how much alcohol was consumed by my ex. The weird thing was, the whole house felt darker and smaller the longer we lived there. Almost as if the toxicity of our relationship was infecting the place. I was going to bed on a normal weeknight, And as I got up to turn the TV off and head upstairs, my ex was still out drinking. I felt a deep sense of dread. Like I wanted to do anything but go upstairs and go to bed. But I couldn't sleep on the couch because that's usually where my ex would crash when he got home after a night drinking. So I forced myself to stop being foolish and go upstairs. I took a hot bath and settled into bed with the lights on and bright to read for a bit. Around midnight, I heard my ex-husband come home and stumble upstairs into his room. But the sense of dread and terror didn't subside. It grew. I couldn't shake it and finally decided I just needed to go to bed so I wouldn't miss work the next day. I got up, turned off the light, and immediately couldn't breathe for the sense of fear I was having. My door was closed, but I could feel the thing. There was something on the stairs. It was made from shadow, but much darker. It had a maw of a shadow and would consume people whole. I am a rational person. I know it was a crazy thing to think, and I know it wasn't real. But at that moment, it was. It was going to come up the stairs, eat my ex, my son, and then me, unless I kept the light on and stayed awake. I tried closing my eyes and going to sleep, but every time I did, I could feel it moving up the stairs. That's crazy, though. Then, I heard the creak. See, the middle step on the stairs creaks if you step on it, in that almost cartoony way. The only time it creaks is when it's stepped on. I jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and sprinted out to check the stairs. No one was there. I could hear my ex snoring in his room. I checked on my son, and he was sound asleep. The cat was curled up on his bed. I ended up spending the night reading in bed with all the lights on, but I could still feel the thing, even if I couldn't see it. As soon as the sun peeked over the horizon, I finally passed out, exhausted. But the feeling and the thing went away. The next night, after a very tiring day, I spent the night at my boyfriend's house so I could sleep. The day after, I went back to my house, and once more, as soon as I went to bed, I could feel it again. This time, I spent the evening looking up ghosts and such on my iPad and looking at ways to clear negative energies or spirits. I ended up getting some of the sage I had grown in my garden, along with some other herbs, and burning it in our house, especially on the stairwell. The thing was gone, but a few weeks later, I moved in with my boyfriend, and one of the first things he did was sage the house. Several months later, my ex starts tweeting really strangely one night. He's tweeting that he is all but certain that he had heard something on the stairs and that his room now feels like something is living there. He talks about how creepy it feels and how it's a shadow creature, and he senses that it wants to eat him. I had never mentioned my experience to him because I didn't want him making fun of me for it. So far, nothing has happened beyond him feeling like there's something living in the room. But I did find out that while we lived there, 4 other couples got divorced, including a sweet old couple that had been together for over 40 years. I am completely convinced that that shadow thing is a creation of negative emotion. The Woman in Black, submitted by user SublimeJunke. This happened in a town in Montana that is fairly populated. We lived in the middle of town around 2011-2012. 2 major things that I forgot. I had an okay childhood, up until my mother met my late stepfather. She ended up getting addicted to drugs and toting me and my 2 siblings along with her while we were homeless, starving, and all they cared about was getting more drugs. We ended up living in my stepdad's parents' RV for a bit, since all we had was a car to sleep in. It was a 90s model bus-looking RV, and it was a good 32 feet long. Now, I noticed things attached to my parents before, but we've never lived somewhere like that RV before. It was parked behind my stepdad's parents' house the entire time. My parents were too high to actually perceive what was going on, but us kids started to notice small things. My stepdad decided to take a kitten offered by a hobo downtown one day. He was a good kitty and loved us. He lived in the RV with us, but did not like it. He hated it and would scream until we let him out. We would come home after school and find our cat in one of the many cupboards the RV had. If you've never been in an RV before, the cupboards have a safety feature on the handle where you have to pinch the handles to release the door. It was really hard for us kids to open it. And my parents, no matter how high they were never the type to mess around with animals, and they were never home. But almost every day, we would discover the cat locked in one of these cupboards. It wasn't that he found a way in. There's absolutely no way in because the people who owned it barely used it, and it was in pretty good condition. The sheer amount of anxiety us children got when someone left us alone in that RV was incredible. We always used the buddy system. All three of us kids talked about it and concluded that the RV had a spirit or spirits, and that's why it felt scary to be there. It didn't want us there. If all three of us were together, we felt safe. But as soon as one was left alone, the place would get cold. And we would start to feel so overwhelmingly anxious that we would run out in fear. We weren't just kids making up scary stories. I didn't want to fear this place, but it was a feeling I could not control. Like something was bestowed upon me to experience and I could not get rid of it. My stepdad had back problems, but one time he was stuck in bed for a week straight. I blamed the drugs and his back pains, yes, but he claimed something was holding him down in bed. He said he felt a presence holding him in place. None of us could lift him out of the bed besides my mom. She struggled so hard and he was screaming and crying. My mom said that he wasn't that heavy, but she struggled because it felt like he had gained 50 pounds overnight. It took my mom 20 minutes to finally rip him out of bed, and as soon as she helped him out of the RV, he stretched and shook it off. He was instantly fine with no pain. One day, my sister and I went to get our parents for some reason out of the RV. It was the middle of the day, and we see my mom sitting on the arm of one of the chairs, and my stepdad was sitting on the couch, maybe 2 or 3 feet apart from each other. Then, we saw this woman, dressed in all black, sitting on the chair that my mom was sitting on the arm of. She was dressed neatly. She had on a black dress. Her face was messed up though. Her head was hung and her eyes were fuzzy, almost like she was crying. Her skin was white and her hair was fuzzy and looked messy but neat. She would raise her head to listen to my parents when they addressed her. We thought this was their drug dealer or something. We talked about it later and wondered where she came from and why she didn't talk to them, only listened. We asked our parents who that woman in black was. They turned pale and asked us to repeat ourselves. They apparently had no idea who we were talking about. What I gather is that when we saw the woman in black, they were on something. You know when tweakers start to talk to themselves, or it seems as though they're talking to someone who clearly isn't there? They were talking very fast when this lady was there, and they were rocking back and forth. I don't think they realized that their meth rambles were actually a one-sided conversation with this thing. The woman in black did not scare us, but we felt this hunger from her. She felt open to something, and it was a negative energy. I only saw this woman once more. She never messed with the children, she only focused on my parents, and she only came by when they were incoherent. As a child, I didn't know, but I do know now that when she came around, it was when they were absolutely geeked out on meth. She loved being around them. She would sit there and listen and nod her head. They made no sense to us, but to her, they made perfect sense, even when they couldn't form words. The last time I saw her was when we were sitting at the fire pit having a fire one night. I could see her shadow every time the flames kicked up a little bit, bringing the light to the yard. I never saw her after that, but I knew she was there. She was always there, holding on to their addictions. Despite the woman still being around, my parents were spooked that day we told them about the lady, and decided to take us somewhere to clear everyone's head. This must have really ticked something off, because when we got back to the RV, all of us agreed to sleep in the car that night after what we saw. The RV was facing the street and had curtains on the windshield. There was a street light in front of the RV. Those curtains were always closed no matter what, since we lived there. We got home and we saw the front curtains were open. And the inside of the RV was pitch black, even though the streetlight shines right through it. We should have been able to see the details of the RV, at least a little bit from where we were, like the front seats and steering wheel, given that there was a streetlight right there. But the light did nothing. It was like an energy had taken over in there and was waiting with welcome arms for us to go back in and feed off of the negative. It stayed that way for a week, and we didn't go back in for that long. I want to clarify some things, though, for those who think a spirit encounter can either be true or false. A lot of fear came from my parents being drug addicts. They acted just like us kids. Instead of telling us it's okay and the spirits won't hurt us, they let their paranoia take over, which seemed to attract the energy even more. If my parents weren't doing meth, this wouldn't have happened, though I lived with their BS for long enough to know the difference between negative feeders versus them being dumb and seeing things and overreacting. And when I think back to the first time I saw the woman, all I see is my parents talking to an empty chair. But I can still remember what she looks like. I know truly that drugs of all kinds can form a gateway or a welcoming atmosphere for spirits to sit and rest and feed off your energy. I've witnessed all kinds of messed up energies, clinging on to my addict friends from high school. I am completely sober when I recognize these energies nowadays. I didn't have to be high to see that. I just had to be in the presence of the addict energy. Once, I was hanging out with a friend who wasn't doing great. He was high at the time but had ingested it before we met up. After a while, walking around in the dark, he stopped and he told me that he sees a shadow man. No big deal, he says, he sees them all the time, and commented on how he was the only one that could see it. I told him, "No, I can see it. It's walking towards us, right?" I can't imagine having so many shared hallucinations with people. The Derby Hat Man, submitted by MHal9000. This happened years ago when I was still a child. It's probably one of my earliest memories, to tell the truth, but I can still remember it quite clearly. We were living in a house in Chicago. I can't remember exactly where, but I do remember my mom saying that we were less than a dozen blocks from where John Wayne Gacy had lived. That has no relevance to this particular story, however. I woke up in the middle of the night for some reason. I remember not being immediately afraid, but a feeling of unease started settling in on me as I lay there in the dark. I didn't hear anything, and I didn't see anything, but I was convinced that I needed to get across the hall to my parents' bedroom so I could crash with them. I didn't open the door immediately, because by this time, that sense of dread was quite pronounced. I finally cracked it and peeked open. Nothing. And right across from my door was my parents' bedroom door. It may as well have been the Grand Canyon, though, because I was having a heck of a time screwing up the courage to walk those few feet from my doorway to theirs. The hallway our rooms were in led from our living room and ended back to where our rooms were at. It wasn't a long distance, and the living room and most of the hallway were illuminated by a moonlit sky from the big picture window in the front of the house. The window did not face the hallway, nor were there any mirrors or other windows that were visible from my vantage point. I mention this specifically because it is relevant to the story. I finally decide I'm going to do it, so I opened the door fully and peeked out and down the hallway towards the living room. Nothing there. Lean back into my room, and then peek out again. This time, there's a silhouette at the far end of the hallway. A black, solid silhouette that looks two-dimensional and seems to be wearing a derby hat. Remember the Looney Tune cartoons where Bugs Bunny or another character would walk up to a mirror or window and the other character would mimic their movements? That's what was happening. It was leaning out from behind the living room wall on the same side of the house as me and was at about the same height. To say I didn't like this would be the understatement of the century. I remember leaning back into my room and just knowing that I had to get to my parents. Staying in the room was not an option. I looked out again, and again saw that form lean out from the living room. I leaned back into my room, screwed up my courage, and jumped from my doorway to my parents' room. I had their doors opened, all the while looking down the hallway, and saw nothing coming at me. I went to close their door and climb into bed, taking one last peek down that hallway. The silhouette leaned out again, but this time on the same side of the house as my parents' room, still playing the mimicking game. That was it for me. I shut the door and buried myself between my parents and somehow fell asleep. I don't remember anything else happening in that house, and over the years the memory did fade, till about 2000 or 2001. I was driving home late, around 12 a.m., and the only radio station I could hear was playing Art Bell's Coast to Coast. It was noise, so I listened to it while finishing up the drive. They had a session about shadow people, and some of the descriptions were enough to make me hit their website when I got home. Imagine my surprise when I saw some of the drawings the users had sent in were of two-dimensional shadow men wearing bowler derby hats. And that's all for this episode. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts and theories. Personally, I feel that whatever these shadow figures are, they feed off negativity, either fights, arguments, or sadly addiction. Let me know what you think. Send me an email at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com. In the meantime, I hope all you ghouls stay safe and are safe from what lurks in the shadows.